Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is part three of the exploration and colonization recorded lecture topic. This is one of my favorite things to teach on, both in world history and in U.S. history, just because I think it's so fascinating what leads to the Europeans from a few countries to explore Africa, Asia, and the Americas, because there's several different causes of this exploration, and it forever changed the course of world history. That's without question. And so I like to start out talking about this by looking at a map. Now, this map is obviously looks kind of weird, but you can see this is kind of like considered the known map of the world at the time of Columbus's voyage in 1492. And so the Vikings had gone in a few centuries before and gone to Iceland and Greenland. Okay. Also, the Vikings had gone over here, but that settlement hadn't made it. And so we don't know how far south they went, but we do know they went into this region of Canada. And so before Columbus's voyage, the Portuguese had gone down to here. They had not gone around the coast of Africa. In fact, because of Columbus's voyage going west, they ended up doing that. So let me explain a couple things going on geographically. At this time in world history, there are four major trade routes, and they're tremendously prosperous, affluent, and brought tremendous prosperity for the nations who had major economic plays on these trade routes. Okay, the Indian Ocean trade route is right here, and this is where Columbus is trying to get. Okay, also the Silk Road had declined by the time of Columbus's voyage, but it had gone from China all the way to the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean sea trade the Europeans were very much familiar with, had been trading on this for quite some time, and then the trans-Saharan trade route as well. And so because these goods from the Indian Ocean trade that were very luxurious, when the Silk Road declined, the Indian Ocean rose in prominence. The Indians would trade with the Arabs right here in the Middle East, and then they would trade it to the Ottomans. And the Ottomans would, in turn, trade it to the various Italian city-states, like the Venetians, the people from Florence, Genoa, and others. And then they would, in turn, raise the price as it got to the rest of Europe. Okay, so you're paying several middleman costs. And so they wanted to find a direct, faster route to luxuries of the Indian Ocean trade. Okay, so it's kind of like I'll give you an example. When I worked at Joseph A. Bank years ago, selling men's suits, I remember that they used to have all these kind of annoying commercials that would appear on TV, like buy one, get two free. And you're like, what in the world? How the heck are you affording buy one suit, get two free? Well, here's why. Joseph A. Bank had cut out the middleman. Their suits were made in either Mexico or Indonesia, okay, down here. And so Men's Warehouse, who actually later bought out Joseph A. Bank, they could never offer those deals because Men's Warehouse carried name brand suits. They carried like Chaps Ralph Lauren, Jones New York, and many other brands. So they could do about 50% off, okay, but they could never afford to do the buy one, get two free. Now, Joseph A. Bank, on the other hand, could. You know why? Because they manufactured their own suits, and they had cut out the middleman. They didn't buy suits from another manufacturer. They made them themselves. And so a suit they were retailing at that time for about $800 was costing them about $90 to make. Okay, so even when they were actually, instead of buy one, get two free, it was actually 70% off was your best deal. Back when they were, even if they offered it 70% off and you're buying a suit for, say, I don't know, $270, they're still getting a sizable profit off you because it costs them about $90 to make that suit. Even after they pay for their stores, retail, and electricity, and the wages of the employees, and the transportation costs, they're still making a profit off of you. Okay. And of course, that's since changed because they got bought up by Men's Warehouse and they have a different business model. But you get the point. Okay. Also, one of the things that had happened, had ended in the 1200s, was the Last Crusade. The last Christian city at Aachen had been defeated by Muslims in the Middle East. And so you had this, not only this former military competition taking place between European Christians and Middle Eastern Muslims, but this has been going on since the 700s when Islam had first spread across North Africa very violently into Spain, and they lost at the Battle of Tours, led by Charles Martel. Okay, they'd also expand all the way into India to the east. Okay, Islam spreads through trade and conquest. We talked a lot about that in world history, and so you have this major competition that's taking place, both economically, but also kind of militarily, religiously, and so forth. That's happening. Also, Europeans are going to have some other factors that lead to this happening. Okay. So we talked about Islam and the spice trade. The Crusades had really opened the eyes of the Europeans. Okay. So Europeans came to the Crusades in 1098. They took Jerusalem in 1099, and they held Jerusalem for around 100 years or so. Okay, but what interesting is Europeans began exposed to these incredible luxury goods coming from the Silk Road and coming from the Indian Ocean trade up to the Arabian Peninsula. Now, the Byzantine Empire over here in present-day Istanbul had been buying these luxuries for some time, and at times they would sell it to the Europeans, but not as much. The Byzantine Empire in its heyday was extremely wealthy, and so they're wanting these luxury goods, spices, silk, porcelain coming from China, and among other luxury goods, and so they wanted it. Okay, so the Renaissance is kind of this revival of European literature and thinking and so forth. You have Christianity playing a big role in that. You have some parts of the Renaissance that um, is influenced by Christianity, other is kind of more humanistic and so forth. And so you also have these explorations that had taken place. One, Marco Polo had been trading on the Silk Road, served in the court of Kublai Khan, the grandson of the great Genghis Khan, or we properly call him Genghis Khan in the United States, but probably because of Genghis Grill, which is good, by the way. But anyway, but Marco Polo, his exploration stuff had actually kind of got published while he was in prison. He went back to his home city in Italy, which he got captured by a rival city state, and he was in prison. And the guy who was in prison with him actually wrote down his accounts. So a lot of people thought it was fake, but it still struck the imagination. Historians have proven that it most likely did occur, and so forth. And then the Portuguese began exploring down the west coast of Africa. Now, it's because of Columbus's voyage, they decided to completely go around the Horn of Africa, which is very dangerous in seas, and then go up the West African coast and the East African coast and trade with the East African city states, and then also make their way to India. Okay. Also, these monarchs finally had the wealth, the power, and the resources to be able to do this exploration. China had it when they sent out the explorations of Zheng He or Zheng He, depends how you pronounce it. The Ming Dynasty could have conquered the world if they wanted to with their powerful navy under Zheng He. They could have gone to the western coast of the Western Hemisphere if they wanted, but they didn't. So they had China kind of had a monopoly on the economy and didn't really have the competition, economic demand the way the Europeans do. Okay, and that's a big cornerstone kind of in this time period in world history. Also, the Europeans developed better ships. I mean, the Chinese, one of the things that made their navy so powerful, they had these powerful, they were called junk ships. They were not junk. They were amazing, huge ships that could have conquered the world with their powerful navy if they wanted. But the Europeans had some good seaworthy ships that were able to withstand the nasty Atlantic storms. The Pacific doesn't have the storms the way the Atlantic does. Okay. We talked about the Crusades, trying to cut out the middleman, talked about the Renaissance. You also have the Protestant Reformation. Okay, and that's going to be a huge driving factor for basically colonization. As we'll see in U.S. history, there's several religious groups that come over that are going to be Protestant, also some Catholic refugees as well. And you cannot shortchange the importance of religion in American history because it's from our earliest foundings with Europeans first coming over there. We're going to talk a lot about how the Protestant Reformation are going to lead to that. Also, the Catholic Reformation led to tremendous amount of Catholic missionaries, these priests going out to evangelize. You have the Jesuits, the Franciscans, the Dominicans that go out all across the Western Hemisphere. They go into different parts of Southeast Asia and even into Japan. They try to go to China, try to make China a Christian nation, but they are unsuccessful at that time in world history doing so. Also, monarchs are, it's all about competition. It's the rise of what will eventually become capitalism. We'll see full scale capitalism when we get to the first phase of industrial revolution. But right now, what we're seeing is what's called mercantilism. We'll talk about that throughout this module. Okay. Also, technological advances. We're going to look at some new navigation things that allowed the Europeans to be much more exploration and across the sea. They're going to take lantine sails, which have been in the Indian Ocean, and what we call period 2 in world history. They're able to use them to help you catch a side wind a lot easier. They're going to have a new improved compass that the Chinese originally made. They're going to use the astrolabe that also the Chinese have made. And so forth. And so the sextant allows you to measure distance. You've traveled at night by using the stars. That all came from the Indian Ocean trade. And that, going to the Crusades, exposed the Europeans to these incredible innovations. Okay. And also, people are looking for glory and make a lot of money. And there's going to be individuals who do make a lot of money from this. Okay. Here's what an astrolabe looked like in 1532. Also, better maps. Okay. Now, what they thought of the Western Hemisphere originally looked ridiculous, but there's a sextant. You use it to measure your distance you traveled at night in a logbook. So that way, let's say you want to go back to the Caribbean. Well, you can use the stars to kind of measure your distance you've traveled each day, so that way you can get back to the same location. And Mariner's Compass, one of the most important innovations of world history. So there is a caravel ship. It sits on the water like an egg. It also had these new lantine sails, which were not new to world history. They've been in the Indian Ocean trade since period 2, but they had been very important. Okay, and allows them to catch not just direct winds, but also side winds, and then also firearms. The Mongols had actually spread gunpowder technology to the Europeans on the Silk Road trade. What's ironic is the Chinese developed gunpowder for fireworks and then later used it to shoot out flaming arrows at the Mongols. The Mongols were blown away by it, and they, well, figuratively, not literally, I guess at times maybe literally, but they figuratively were amazed at gunpowder, and they began wanting the Chinese to make gunpowder weapons for them. And so even though China develops gunpowder weapons, later firearms allow the British to subdue the Chinese because they don't continue to develop them, which is foolish. Okay, so this is where the trans-Saharan trade is going. Lots of gold, salt, ivory, among other things that are being traded on there, dates, and all kind of stuff. So the Portuguese go down here and slowly work their way and trade. You also have a prince of Portugal, and here's where Portugal is right there. Lisbon was the capital at the time. Prince Henry the Navigator created this kind of like a university, okay? Because one thing that Christianity did encourage was learning, and these European countries had founded these universities, which helped kind of foster and nourish the Renaissance. And so this was kind of like a school for sailors, okay? Kind of like a trade school for welders, except for sailors. And so they learned these skills, and they would go and go explore the west coast of Africa. Columbus came from Italy, which the Italians had been dominating trade on the Mediterranean Sea trade along with the Ottomans. In fact, even though they had a big rivalry, they were very much dependent on each other. So the Italian city-states and the Ottomans, you got to have them. Okay. So after Columbus's first voyage, which I'll cover in just a second, Vasco da Gama in 1497. See, Columbus went in 1492, it's 5 years later. He goes around the Horn of Africa, took him a lot of difficulty. Went there first and turned around and said, see, I'm coming back. Actually, that was Diaz. Then you have Da Gama, went up and traded in Zanzibar and Mombasa. And when they got to the East African city-states, which were these wealthy trading cities that were not united, they demand that they give the Europeans a monopoly on trade. And they're like, yeah, right. How are you going to force that? And they tell them not to trade with Muslims. Well, ironically, the East Africans were Muslim. Okay, that's why they converted, because of this trade connection on the Indian Ocean. Okay, because Islam spreads through trade and conquest. Trade is a big one. Okay, so actually it spreads more through trade in other parts of the world than it does through conquest. And so then Da Gama goes over here to Calcutta, one of the most important trade cities on the Indian Ocean trade. So those who take me world history will talk a lot about Calcutta. And they bring some crappy stuff, and the leader of Calcutta laughs at him. And he's like, "What is this junk?" But what they did accept was the few gold or silver pieces he had. So Da Gama comes back a few years later, and he rolls up with a bunch of ships, and he actually conquers Calcutta. And who's laughing now? Because Da Gama is able to control that and Joa's port trade cities. And so you'll see that'll be kind of how the Portuguese and Spanish run things. If you don't play along, then they try to subdue you militarily. Okay, they were pretty aggressive. This is a map of the known world. Okay, so it's supposed to be Europe right here. It's supposed to be Africa, which looked like a big blob. This is supposed to be Indian Ocean trade, along with Asia up here. And so what exactly is the Renaissance? We covered this more in world history. Okay. The Renaissance, those that were living at that time never would have thought they were going through the Renaissance. But economically, it leads to better trade, okay, and exploration and technology. Culture, though, it revives ancient Latin and Greek education, and they also bought different Muslim arts and so forth. And I wouldn't say learning is rediscovered; learning is just expanded and increased. Okay, and so also focus on humanism and the use of reason, and it's later going to you could connect that eventually is going to influence the Enlightenment later, and you have some of world history's most famous artists and sculptors, Michelangelo, Da Vinci. You also have playwrights like Shakespeare, but of course I loved Ninja Turtles as a kid, so there's Michelangelo, Leonardo, Donatello, and Raphael, who were Italian artists and so forth. Also politics, you're going to have both the Protestant and Catholic Reformations, which we cover in world history. And so the Catholic Church is going to have a Catholic Reformation to kind of clean up some of its abuses, but actually it leads to even though Catholicism loses a lot of adherents in Europe because they become Protestants, it actually expands rapidly in other parts of the world, particularly the Western Hemisphere south of the Rio Grande. It's one of the greatest spreading of religions in world history. Okay. Also, the power of the Catholic Church is kind of busted a little bit. It loses its power in many areas. It withstands its power in some areas like Spain and parts of France and some German states and Italy, but it loses its power in other places like England, the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries. Okay. So it is an intellectual movement. A lot of cool art came from there. I want to take my wife to Rome to experience some of that one day. Okay, so let's look at what a lot of times that you learned in like eighth grade history. Okay, the three G's: gold, God, glory. All right, yeah, you can remember gold, God, and glory all you want, but if you don't know what they're actually referring to, then it's worthless. Okay, so the glory part, political. Okay, this competition, they want to become a world power. Portugal wanted to one up the Italian city states without question. Spain didn't want Portugal to one up them, okay, and beat them out. England is going to try to play catch up after they beat the Spanish Armada. The Netherlands, after they declare independence from Spain and King Philip V or Philip II, they're going to expand economically tremendously. The French, their arch rival, the British, they can't let them one up them, and so forth. And these countries are going to vie for power without question. They're going to vie for power. Economic, they were looking for new trade routes because they were trying to get the Indian Ocean trade. They were trying to get a direct access, cut out that middleman, and make money. Okay, and rich individuals like merchants and rich the treasury of monarchs, because of mercantilism. Okay, mercantilism consists of three parts. One, how much gold and silver you have in your treasury equals power. So they want this gold or silver, whatever it is, luxury goods, to increase their power. Second thing with mercantilism, colonies are there to benefit the mother country. We'll get to that later. And then thirdly, you always want to sell more than what you're buying. Well, they want to get more luxury goods, and then they can export them to other parts of Europe. Okay, and then lastly, religious. Okay, I've already covered this when I talked about Da Gama going to the East African city states, but they want to spread Christianity. Christianity is a proselytizing religion. So is Islam. Okay, so is Buddhism. Is they want to convert others to their religion, and they send out missionaries to do so. Okay, missionaries are people who try to go out and proselytize, evangelize, convert somebody to their religion. Okay. Now let's talk about the Spanish. They're the first to pursue colonization because they go west first. Okay. So they first colonize the Caribbean, then they go to Central America with Cortez, and then they go to South America with Pizarro, which we're going to cover as well. They created the first permanent colonies in what became the United States. We have St. Augustine of Florida. So if we were talking about world history, we wouldn't even talk about St. Augustine since it's U.S. history. St. Augustine is the first permanent European settlement in the U.S. Notice I said permanent, okay, because there was others potentially by the Vikings, but it didn't make it. All right. So Columbus is going to make 4 voyages: 1492, 93, 98, and 1502. Okay, so how do you remember it? 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Now, Columbus actually died, broke, and thought he was a failure. And yet we celebrate Columbus Day. There's all these things labeled in the Western Hemisphere, and they're named after him. District of Columbia, Columbia University. There's a whole country called Columbia, and so forth. But we could keep going. British Columbia in Canada. But his greatest achievement, okay, that first bullet right there, when you write it down, I want you to highlight it, star it, underline it, circle it, whatever you got to do to remember it. But he established a permanent relationship between Europe and the Americas. That is Columbus's greatest achievement in world history. He brought the East and the West together permanently. The Vikings could have done that. They didn't. China had the ability to do it, but they didn't. Okay. He brought a permanent relationship between the East and the West, Europe and the Americas. Okay. Now, he was not trying to prove the world was round, which is a common misconception that has since been disproven in history. Sailors that had experience, they knew that the world was round. Okay. Maybe think, well, how would they know that? Well, when they would watch a ship go off in the distance, they would see it go down instead of it disappear. Go down because of the curvature of the earth. They could look out for a long, long, long way off, particularly when they developed scopes and so forth, or binoculars. So what is his reason for going? He is trying to find a faster route to the West Indies, okay, which is basically the Indian Ocean trade. That's what he's wanting. Indian Ocean trade, Indian Ocean trade, Indian Ocean. We call it the West Indies. That's what they call it at the time. That's the Indian Ocean trade, okay? He wanted to cut out the middlemen of the Arabs and the Italians. Now, he was actually Italian, but he would have made a lot of money by the Spanish crown. Spain also had just recently driven out part of the last part of the Crusades, the Reconquista. They had reconquested the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims. The Moors from North Africa had conquered Spain and almost tried to conquer France till the Battle of Tours, and Charles Martel drove them back. And so there were several different Christian kingdoms that were in the very far north that survived, and they slowly over time pushed the Moors south to eventually they captured the last Moorish city at Granada. That's why you see some beautiful Middle Eastern Islamic architecture, such as the mosque at Cordoba in Spain, that is a great example of the time of the Moors living there. And so they were riding high on this patriotism of Spain defeating the Moors at Granada, and so they had this new wealth, conquering the city. They can send out the voyage. If that doesn't happen, Columbus doesn't go. Okay, we never know how world history would have turned out. Okay, so here's his expeditions. He goes to the Caribbean, which is crazy to me, is he goes to the beautiful Caribbean, and it wasn't even hurricane season, and he went back. What in the world? Why was he not staying? That's like people would live there for vacation if they could, except during hurricane season. And he goes back to Spain, which is shocking. And he doesn't stay. I would have retired there. I would have gone back in 1502. I would have stayed in the Caribbean. Okay. Let's look at some other explorers who are going to be excelling. Magellan. Okay, we see Dr. Scholl's. Are you Magellan, or whatever these commercials that they have now that are kind of catchy, but Ferdinand Magellan was the first. Well, his crew. He didn't survive. He was killed by in a dispute in the Philippines. He was trying to help out a rival chieftain with his other chief, and ended up getting killed in the process. But Ferdinand Magellan's crew circumnavigated the world in 1522. Well, they did it more in 1522. That's when they actually made it back. It took longer than that, but they left Portugal, sailed around the coast of South America, went across the Pacific, ended up in the Philippines, which is where Magellan gets killed, and then made it around the coast of Africa, starving and eating maggot-infested food, but they were able to survive. Okay, so like I said, it's just a close-up view of Columbus's four voyages. Okay, so because Portugal, who had originally gone around the coast of Africa after Columbus's voyage, they at one point get blown off course and ended up on the coast of Brazil. And so here, with the Protestant Reformation happening, Europe's fighting itself religiously and so forth, the Pope doesn't want two Catholic majority countries to fight each other. So Portugal and Spain are kind of these dominant Catholic countries in Europe. And so he didn't want to create peace. Now, they didn't have a clue that any of this, all this stuff existed. But he kind of drew a line and said, all right, anything over here, the Treaty of Tordesillas, Portugal gets all of this, okay, and Spain was supposed to just get over this over here, but look at all this stuff that Spain actually gets, or at least they lay claim to. Now, if the Pope would have realized that all this existed, he probably would have moved this line right over to about here, okay, but he doesn't. So, but nonetheless, Portugal gets a short on the stick. But don't feel bad for Portugal; they're making bank off of the Indian Ocean trade, which they have set up trade posts and are dominating, and also from sugar here in Brazil. So don't feel bad for them. Okay, here's where Columbus went. He and his crew was fairly not nice, I guess you want to be blunt, to some of the natives of the Caribbean. They were fascinated by him, but thought it was odd that they did not have any clothing on. They thought that was immodest. What's crazy, though, is that Native Americans, one disease they did have, besides tuberculosis, was they had syphilis. And within 50 years of Columbus's first voyage, syphilis, an STD, makes it all the way to China. So that's how quickly sailors spread that STD around. Okay. Now, one of the greatest things that have ever happened in world history is what's called the Columbian Exchange. You must know this. If you were taking me for world history, you would absolutely have quiz and test questions on it. But for U.S. history, you're going to have to know it as well, because you will see this on a test or a quiz or both. Actually, you'll see it on both. Chances are. So if you look right here at the top, those are all the items that the Western Hemisphere possessed that the Eastern Hemisphere did not. So you look at this: squash, turkey, cocoa. So eventually it's used to make chocolate, because actually cocoa is actually bitter. I've actually had real chocolate that's not sweet, and it is very bitter. The Europeans put sugar in it to make it taste better, but Native Americans drank it for like a ritual drink. Peanuts, okay, the greatness that became peanut butter was only possible because of the Western Hemisphere. Avocados, so if you want guacamole, got to have it in the Western Hemisphere. Pumpkins, think about Thanksgiving and Halloween, wouldn't be possible without the Western Hemisphere and the Columbian Exchange. Pineapple, the Caribbean, okay. Tomatoes, wouldn't be possible to have ketchup. It's crazy that for much of the world history, the world's population was absent of the greatness that is ketchup. Peppers, tobacco, cassava, vanilla, sweet potatoes, quinine, the regular potato, maize. Quinine is used to treat malaria, by the way, prevent malaria, and then syphilis. But you look down here, look at all the things the Eastern Hemisphere provided. All of these things. What's crazy is Kentucky is called the bluegrass state. The bluegrass weed was not even native to the Western Hemisphere. It was brought over by Europeans on accident. Horses, pigs were all brought over. Okay, rice. I think it's South Carolina and East Arkansas and Stuttgart, rice capital USA, wouldn't have been possible without the Columbian Exchange. Okay, potatoes, which end up taking off in Ireland, potatoes actually double the size of the Eastern Hemisphere's population, because it produces more calories per acre than any other crop of world history. Okay, but look at what also it gets brought: smallpox, malaria, whooping cough, measles, typhus, diphtheria, flu. Whew, ouch. Okay. Also, the horse. We glorify Great Plains Native Americans in movies because we love a good. I love Western movies. I love them. But the horse was not actually brought to the Great Plains until about the 1700s. Technically, it was brought to New Mexico in the 1500s, but most Native American tribes did not have it till the 1700s. That is fascinating. You look at the disease that is brought by the Columbian Exchange. It is far worse than the Black Death. We remember the Black Death because it ravishes Asia, it ravishes the Middle East, it ravishes Egypt. The rest of Africa is kind of insulated because of this thing called the Sahara Desert. But it takes out about a third of Europe's population. But you don't have anything that kills a greater percentage of the population than smallpox does in the Western Hemisphere. Santo Domingo, okay, where it's like the Haiti and Dominican Republic today, 4 million in 1496 for Native Americans. Less 100 years later, you got down to 125 people. That's all the Native Americans that are left in less than 100 years because of smallpox. It is the biggest killer of world history, period. Okay. That's a typo on my part. So it's Mexico, not Mexico. Okay. 50 million total Indians before Europeans, estimated. About 3 million by the end of the 600s. Now, their population does stabilize to about 7.5 million by the 700s because they develop eventually immunizations. So why in the world did Native Americans not have some of these big civilization killers? They had syphilis, they had tuberculosis. Well, as they have theorized, and it's a pretty commonly accepted theory, is when Native Americans migrated down on the Bering Strait through Alaska, down to an ice age, these diseases don't thrive in very cold climates. And so what you end up having is these for generations, they eventually aren't exposed to smallpox or typhus or malaria or typhoid fever. And so all of a sudden, generations and generations down the way, they're not passing down these immunities to these diseases. That's why they didn't have it. It's kind of a medical fascination, really. Here's some other explorers. John Cabot actually sails for different country, even though he's Venetian. But he discovers Newfoundland, sails for Britain. So don't you love the British way of naming land? Newfoundland. Wow, that was real creative. Vasco Nunez de Balboa, not to be confused with Rocky Balboa. As I'm making this lecture, there's a new Rocky type movie coming out called Creed 2, which looks interesting. But Balboa was the first European to ever see the Pacific Ocean from the Western Hemisphere's view. There's Europeans who had seen the Indian Ocean and stuff like that. But Ferdinand Magellan circumnavigated the globe, or at least his crew did. He died. Also, one of the things that helps these explorers have advantages is they got guns, they've got steel swords, iron, explosives thanks to gunpowder. Not like throwing like grenades, but you get the idea. Armor that help them have a cultural and a military advantage. Okay. So now, in the Spain's empire in the 1600s, look how far it extended. Wow. We're going to be covering that. Okay. It's pretty impressive. All right. Before we do, though, we're going to stop there. We're going to get to that in part 4 of this lecture, and we'll talk about New Spain and that. Okay.